Condemn me if you will, but history will absolve me. Fidel Castro made this famous speech at his trial in October 1953, in which he justified armed insurrection against the brutal Batista regime. He spoke about 600,000 Cubans out of work, 500,000 farm labourers living in shacks, thousands of small farmers who don't own their own land, and thousands of underpaid teachers, doctors and engineers. His pleas were ignored and he was jailed for 15 years. After less than 3 years, however, he was released and meant to Mexico. There, with his brother Raúl and his friend Che Guevara, he started the 26th of July movement. His History Will Absolve Me speech became the movement's manifesto. He returned to Cuba and ousted the Batista regime in 1959.
Esos valores ahora estarán presentes. Ahora a este país se le pide un internacionalismo, una misión internacionalista extraordinaria. Salvar la revolución en Cuba, salvar el socialismo en Cuba.
Castro promised a socialist utopia. However, it's arguable that Cubans swapped one form of totalitarianism for another. Batista locked up political opponents, while Castro locked up gays, priests, people with long hair, and political opponents. Alarmed by his revolutionary ideals and his friendship with the Soviet Union, both Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy sought to get rid of him. They tried to assassinate him. Estimates vary from 8 to over 600 attempts. Exploding cigars, poisoned diving suits, poisoned glasses and ballpoint pens, mafia hitmen. It reads like a James Bond movie script. Castro once quipped, "If surviving assassination attempts were an Olympic event, I'd win the gold medal." The Americans tried counter-revolution. The infamous Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 was orchestrated by the CIA, and it failed miserably. The Americans tried economic sanctions, and despite several UN resolutions, many of those sanctions are still in place today. The Soviet Union tried to establish a nuclear missile site in Cuba in 1962. Naturally, the Americans reacted vigorously. In what became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world came the closest it's ever been to a nuclear holocaust.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Since then, relations between Cuba and the USA have ebbed and flowed, mainly ebbed. Love him or loathe him, Castro remained the great survivor. He was in power before the Berlin Wall went up, and he was there after it came down. In fact, he has seen 11 American presidents come and go. In late 1991, the Soviet Union imploded, and this had a devastating effect on Cuba. Almost overnight, it lost most of its imports, 80% of its exports, and almost all its oil. Much of the land had been used to grow sugar, and this market vanished overnight. There was huge food shortages and rationing was introduced. There were power blackouts and petrol shortages, and no spare parts. For example, by 1993, nearly half of Havana's 1,200 buses were idle for lack of parts. Without oil, Cuba's transportation, industrial and agricultural systems were paralysed. It was a war situation without a war, which the government euphemistically called the special period, but the people called it the struggle to survive. Life for the visitor is interesting. No McDonald's, no billboard advertising, no Coca-Cola signs, just murals of bearded rebels, most notably the ubiquitous Che Guevara. Irish artist Jim Fitzpatrick's iconic image of Shay has become the symbol of resistance and revolution throughout the world. What springs to mind when we think of Cuba? Well, it has an exotic flavour to it. Rum and rumba, cars and cigars, friendly people, music and laughter. There is all of this in abundance. For the visitor, there are no shortages, there are no travel restrictions, and the convertible currency will stretch far. What about life for the average Cuban? Well, life's still a big struggle for most people. The average monthly wage is equivalent to €20 a month, and this is supplemented with food coupons. There are still shortages of everything from needles to anchors. Many items, if they're available at all, can only be bought in convertible currency, and it's very difficult for the average Cuban to get convertibles. In January of this year, state-run food markets in Havana received only 60% of expected deliveries. There's a local joke that says, the reason sex is so popular in Cuba is because it's the only thing Fidel hasn't figured out how to ration. The much-lauded health system is good. You can have a heart bypass tomorrow. Unfortunately, you might die the day after because there are no drugs to sustain you. American sanctions mean that most drugs are unavailable, so folk medicine has become a growth industry. There are other sides to Cuban life, however. Cuban music hit the world stage when Ry Cooder discovered the Buena Vista Social Club. And music is ubiquitous. It seems as if there's a band on every street corner. In the sporting arena, Cuba's boxers have won more medals than any other country in both the Olympics and the World Boxing Championships since 1974. In dance, the Cuban National Ballet School has 3,000 students, and it's the biggest ballet school in the world. After the exotic is worn off, and the visitor begins to see the reality of life there, the grotty tenements, the crumbling edifices, the rubble-strewn foyers, and the potholes to break a leg in, it somehow seems far less glamorous, and anyone with a conscience will develop a deep sympathy for the people. A socialist utopia indeed. What of the future? Well, in 2008, Fidel stepped down and handed over the reins to Raúl, and now Raúl rules the roost. He seems to want to mimic China's success, and he's allowed people to start their own small businesses. He's argued strongly for the need to increase agricultural output and has introduced significant land reform. President Obama has taken a renewed interest in Cuba, and he famously shook hands with Fidel Castro at Nelson Mandela's memorial in December 2013. History was made again on December the 17th, 2014.
Good afternoon. Today, the United States of America is changing its relationship with the people of Cuba. In the most significant changes in our policy in more than 50 years, we will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests, and instead, we will begin to normalize relations between our two countries. Through these changes, we intend to create more opportunities for the American and Cuban people, and begin a new chapter among the nations of the Americas.
For the long-suffering people of Cuba, let's hope that normalization comes sooner rather than later. As to Fidel, will history absolve him? Somehow I doubt it.
De Alto Cero voy para